يعني نحن فتحنا عيوننا اليوم، صار عمرنا بال50 سنة عايشين متعايشين عرب، كراد، تشتشان، مسيحية، أرمن. يعني حياة كانت كتير اجتماعية وكتير حلوة.
We're getting out of the endless wars. We have to do it. And eventually somebody was going to have to make the decision. And frankly, we're getting a lot of praise from that decision.
عودة بعض من الأشوريين اللي برا، لأنه حسوا بالأمان، حسوا بالاستقرار بالمنطقة، حسوا بأنه صار في شيء، وصدق حاولوا أنه يرجعوا ليستقروا في الخابور. من أن وجد التركي على مقارب الخابور أو على مشارف الخابور، فهذيك الفكرة كمان راحت. لا، في لنا تأثير كثير نحن بالنسبة لنا كأشوريين، وجودهم هون كثير عم يأثر علينا. أمانا، لا أمان، لا استقرار، لا حياة يعني فيك تكمل وتعيش وتشتغل بوجودهم هون.
احنا ما كنا يعني انه ناويين حتى نطلع يعني، بس يوم اللي قال طيارة وهو فعلا وصار الضرب وصار في دخول بجباري، دشرنا كل شيء ورفدنا برواحنا يعني.
Okay, I would like to thank Independent of Christians for inviting me to speak today, and I would like to thank North Press for compiling this short video about the impact of the October 2019 Turkish Peace Spring intervention. So we're here today to speak about the Christian minority in Syria, but I would like to begin by stepping back and looking at the larger picture or the Syrian conflict as a whole. And I'm going to be brutally honest in my assessment. I'm speaking, of course, in my personal capacity as a scholar who's conducted research and visited Northeast Syria many times since 2015 and has conducted research in Turkey since 2003. Last week, we co-hosted an event at the Wilson Center with the Free Yazidi Foundation focused on Yazidis in Iraq and Syria. And Ambassador Mark Green pointed out in his opening remarks that we as Americans and the international community were slow to respond to the genocide in 2014. And because we were slow to respond, innocent lives were lost. Now, I believe we are making the same mistake now. We have defeated the territorial caliphate of ISIS, but we are now slow to respond to or even recognize the other threats which are facing ethnic and religious minorities and civilians across Syria. There is an urgency, however, because human beings, regardless of where they come from, cannot be expected to live in tents or IDP or refugee camps forever. There is an urgent need to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people. But the urgency for minorities is even greater, because if we do nothing, or if we are too slow to respond to this current crisis, religious minorities in northern Syria, including Yazidis and Armenians, Assyrian, Syriac Christians, may not survive in their homeland. And this could happen in our lifetime. So we have to acknowledge that although we defeated the Islamic State Caliphate, there is now, as we speak, an ongoing, slow-moving process of demographic change that is happening in northern Syria. There is an ongoing Arabization and Turkification program, which, if left unhindered, may actually exceed in scale the Arabization policies of the Ba'athist regime of previous decades. This Arabization is happening because Turkey launched its interventions in Syria alongside Arab militias some of whom espouse extremist Islamist ideologies, including Falak al-Sham, Ahrar al-Sham, Ahrar al-Shakia, Sultan Murad, and Hamza Division, and others. Now, during the October 2019 Peace Spring intervention, over 200,000 civilians of all backgrounds fled. And only a little over half of those have returned. So why are we slow to recognize this? And why are we unable to address the other myriad threats that minorities face other than ISIS? I think there are two main reasons US policy has essentially been whistling past the graveyard for the past decade. First, our policy was built around the Defeat ISIS campaign, which is understandable given the enormous threat that Daesh previously posed. But we have to now shift our policy from Defeat ISIS or counterterrorism to a policy that will focus on stabilization, rebuilding, and humanitarian aid. And this means that we need to address the variety of other threats that are now facing civilians in the region. And I actually believe, and again, I said I would be brutally honest, but I actually believe American officials have wasted time and resources addressing perceived threats, even imagined threats. And that means we have had less time and less resources to address the very real threats that are threatening hundreds of thousands of people across northern Syria. The report that I just published that Nadine mentioned, for this reason, I entitled the report, Threats Perceived and Real, New Data and the Need for a New Approach to the Turkish SDF Conflict. Now, as hopefully everyone who's watching this knows, the Syrian Democratic Forces is a multi-ethnic force. The majority of the rank and file are Arabs, but it also includes 4 components of Syriac, Assyrian, and Armenians. So there was the Syriac Military Council formed in 2013, the Beit Nahrain Women's Protection Forces formed in 2015, the Martyr Nubar Ozanian Brigade formed in 2018, primarily consisting of Armenians, as well as the Habur Guards. Nabil Water was just featured in the film that I showed. So when I'm speaking about the conflict between Turkey and the SDF, I'm inherently speaking about the conflict with this Christian minority that lives in the region and that is represented in the SDF and in the autonomous administration, as Nadine pointed out. Now, my objective in writing this report is because I wanted to create an objective database that was as objective and as neutral as possible in order to analyze this conflict, because Turkey is an important NATO ally and the Syrian Democratic Forces have been our allies in northern Syria. So I deliberately decided that in writing this report, I would not rely on any statements from either side of the conflict. So I did not rely on any statements from Turkish officials or from SDF or autonomous administration officials. I used ACLA data, one of the most widely used armed conflict data sets ever, anywhere. And together with 2 assistants, we went through thousands of cases of armed conflict events and analyzed and coded them to understand the nature of this conflict along the border. Now, our analysis of ACLID shows that from January 2017, the first period for which they have collected data for both Syria and Turkey, until August of 2020, there were 3,319 attacks from Turkey or Turkish-backed forces against the SDF, YPG, or civilians in Syria, compared to 22 cross-border attacks from the SDF, YPG into Turkey. Of those 22, 10 of them we could not independently even verify happened. So the actual number may be 12. And all of those 12 incidents happened after Turkey launched the October 2019 Peace Spring intervention. In other words, they were in response to the intervention. So although Turkish officials claim that their intervention and their attacks are tit for tat, meaning in response to SDF attacks, that is mathematically impossible. 3,319 compared to 22 cross-border attacks. So this quantitative analysis of the border conflict using ACLA data confirms internal assessments provided by high-ranking US officials on the ground, including Ambassador William Roebuck. Now, I want to give an example of three types of armed conflict events, meaning violent events, that we did not include in this total 3,319. I mean, because we were actually trying to be as systematic as possible and to only, again, include attacks that directly targeted civilians or the SDF or YPG. So as a first example, on September 6, 2020, last fall, Sultan Murad division clashed. I'm reading directly from the ACLA description. Okay, this is not me, this is the ACLA description. Sultan Murad clashed with Hamza division, two Turkish-backed forces, in the countryside of Tel Temur, which is historically an Assyrian Christian region, following a dispute over the takeover of properties owned by displaced civilians. Clashes were accompanied by the exchange of shelling. Several houses were burned down during the clashes. Clashes in Al-Shaifa, Mahmoudiyya, Ainik al-Hawa, Kabur, Karajna, and Manek, so 5 different villages, resulted in the killing of an unknown number of fighters from both sides. So although clearly an event like this impacts civilians because it's their homes that were burned down and were, being appropriated by these armed groups, we didn't even include this kind of an event in the data set because civilians were not directly targeted. To give another example, but these kinds of events make clear why civilians of all backgrounds, not just Christians, but civilians of any background would not want to live in an area where this type of violence is taking place. Again, but this was in the region of Tel Temur. Second example, on November, again, I'm quoting from ACLID, on November 7, 2020, rebel factions operating under the Turkish Operation Peace Spring looted farming equipment from farmers in the villages of Mahmoudiyya, Ainik al-Hawa, Qasamiyya, and Rehaniya in the frontline areas, again, in the countryside of Tel Temur, under the pretext of suspension of farming and cultivation in the region. So, again, like we didn't count this kind of an attack because it wasn't a direct attack on civilians, but it was an attack on civilian infrastructure that obviously people rely on to survive because they need to be able to, as Nadine mentioned, this is a fertile area, the farmland is very fertile and they need to be able to farm in order to feed the population. And a final example I'll give, on January 8th of 2021, an exchange of shelling took place between opposition rebels, which operate under Operation Peace Spring, and the SDF on the front lines of Tel Temur. Turkish forces shelled the perimeter of Tel Temur's power plant, causing damage to the power lines and temporary power cuts in the villages, again, in the countryside of Tel Temur. Now, maybe these 3 examples that I just gave are not direct attempts to persecute Christians or Assyrians, although, again, as we know, Tel Temur is historically an Assyrian and Christian region. But we have to ask ourselves, first of all, why are they operating in that area at all? Because according to the US brokered ceasefire agreement, brokered by former Vice President Pence, Turkey is not allowed to operate in the area of Tel Temur. And yet we see there are constant attacks in this area. Why are they targeting civilian infrastructure like farming equipment and the power plant? And how is the SDF supposed to respond to this? Now, so if anything, the total number of 3,319 attacks underestimates the actual level of the threat that is facing civilians of all backgrounds in this region. And again, this explains why Christians are not coming back to Tel Temur. If you go through these events and you see the level of violence and instability and chaos, etc. So, and again, I want to just highlight again that this intervention in October 2019 resulted in the mass displacement of civilians of all ethnic and religious groups in the region. And the US-Turkish ceasefire agreement was supposed to allow the return of civilians. Again, I quote from the ceasefire agreement, that maximum care would be exercised in order to not cause harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure, and entailed a commitment to safeguard religious and ethnic minorities. So clearly, the ceasefire violations are happening on a regular basis, and the ceasefire agreement is not being enforced. Third, Turkey continues to expand the territory that it controls in northern Syria, again in violation of the ceasefire agreement. As a result of the operation and subsequent expansion, approximately 18 villages inhabited by Yazidis or jointly inhabited by Yazidis and others, and 21 inhabited or jointly inhabited by Syriacs, Assyrians, and Armenians have now fallen under the control of Turkey and Turkish-backed proxies. Fourth, these operations have not resulted in the stability that Turkey desires, but they've only exacerbated the conflict. And so what I think this analysis of the ACLA data shows is that the Turkish intervention in October 2019 was essentially based on a lie. And this claim that they were existentially threatened by the SDF on the other side of the Syrian border is simply, the data does not substantiate this. So what I think we have to ask ourselves now is that, looking back at this conflict since 2014, those innocent people who were killed by Daesh or by other extremist fighters cannot be brought back to life. But the Yazidis, the Christians, the Kurds, the Arabs, who were displaced by this most recent intervention and who lost their homes and their properties and their farmlands, we could make it possible for them to go back to their homes. In fact, that's what the ceasefire agreement requires. Turkey has already committed to protecting civilians and religious and ethnic minorities. So what we have to do is make it possible for these people to be able to go back to their homes and to live there free of persecution. Another issue that I discuss in the report is that these Turkish proxy forces have also captured members of the Syrian Democratic Forces who fought alongside the United States to defeat the Islamic State. They've been captured inside Syria, transferred illegally across the border to Turkey, where they've been forced to sign court documents in Turkish, which they don't understand because they're Syrian citizens who grew up speaking Arabic, and have now been sentenced to have been given long prison sentences. I discussed particularly the case of 3 members of the Syriac Military Council, including 2 Sunni Arabs and 1 Syriac Christian, who now have been given, who are now imprisoned in Turkey. And the Turkish court documents, which I also analyzed, there's an excerpt of one of the documents in my report, shows that although these 3 members of the Syriac Military Council, it actually says in the report they were captured in the area of Ras Al Ain, but then it also says on the same page that the crime that they're accused of was committed in Şanlıurfa, which is Turkey. And so this raises the question of, are these court cases being used, or could they be used in the future to justify essentially Turkish administrative control of Syrian land if they are left unchallenged? So finally, I hope that this new data that I've presented in the report will help inform a new approach to resolving this conflict between Turkey and the Syrian Democratic Forces, and that we have to essentially fundamentally rethink the way we are approaching this conflict, because it is now one that affects not just Turkey and Kurds, but literally every single religious and ethnic group that lives in northern Syria. Thank you.